Picture this. It is exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. You are sitting at your desk, staring at a screen, and suddenly it hits you. It is not just a mild tiredness, it is a profound, almost gravitational pull downward. Your brain gets foggy, your patience wears thin, and there is an overwhelming primal urge to find something sweet, something caffeinated, or ideally both. We have all been there. We have completely normalized this daily crash, treating it as just an inevitable part of being a busy human. But what if we have completely misunderstood what fatigue actually is? What if that afternoon crash has nothing to do with a lack of fuel and everything to do with a catastrophic failure in our body's ability to switch fuel sources?
That is exactly the shift in perspective we need to have. We tend to think of the human body like a smartphone battery it drains down. You plug it in with a snack and it charges back up. But biologically, that is a deeply flawed analogy. The modern human has become metabolically fragile. We are dealing with constant hunger, unpredictable energy crashes, a heavy reliance on sugar, and chronic mental fatigue. We have inadvertently trained our bodies to demand continuous fuel input just to maintain a baseline level of function. But if we look at modern metabolic science, and if we look back at our evolutionary biology, we uncover something truly extraordinary. The human organism was never, ever designed to rely on one single fuel source.
Which brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today. We are talking about a concept that feels almost like a biological superpower, yet it is something every single one of us is born with. Metabolic flexibility. It is the idea that our cells, specifically our mitochondria, are actually dual-engine systems.
Precisely. The human organism evolved with an absolutely remarkable degree of metabolic adaptability. Historically, humans alternated naturally and seamlessly between two primary states, glucose utilization and fat oxidation. This is metabolic flexibility in its purest form. When you have healthy mitochondria, they can efficiently switch between these fuel sources depending on what you are doing, whether you are in a fasting state, how much stress you are under, and what your immediate energy demands are.
It makes perfect sense when you view it through an evolutionary lens. Our ancestors didn't have access to a pantry full of processed snacks every 2 hours. They had to survive periods of intense physical exertion, seasonal variations in food availability, and prolonged fasting. If they crashed every time their blood sugar dropped, our species would not have made it very far.
Exactly. The organism evolved for fuel adaptability, not for constant glucose exposure. The body can generate ATP, the fundamental energy currency of our cells, using glucose, using fatty acids, and using ketone bodies. We are essentially built as sophisticated hybrid vehicles. But the problem is that our modern lifestyle has dramatically impaired this flexibility. Because of how we eat and live today, many people find themselves metabolically trapped. They are entirely dependent on sugar, meaning their bodies have forgotten how to access the massive reserves of energy stored as fat.
So, to use that hybrid car metaphor, it is like we are driving a vehicle that has a tiny electric battery and a massive gas tank. But the software is glitched. We are only running on the tiny battery, and every time it gets low, the car starts sputtering and we panic, desperately searching for a charging station, completely ignoring the fact that we have a full tank of gas right there in the trunk.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it, and the reason that software is glitched comes down to our modern food environment. We are surrounded by ultra-processed carbohydrates, and we are constantly snacking. This frequent eating and chronic carbohydrate exposure lead to continuous insulin stimulation.
Let's dive into insulin because it seems to be the ultimate gatekeeper here. We usually hear about insulin in the context of diabetes, but its role in everyday energy management is massive, isn't it?
It is the absolute master regulator of fuel selection. Insulin essentially helps regulate nutrient storage and glucose utilization. When insulin is present in the bloodstream, it sends a very clear signal to the body. We have plenty of quick energy available, use the glucose and store the rest. But more importantly, when insulin remains chronically elevated, which is what happens when you eat processed carbs all day, fat mobilization becomes completely suppressed. The body locks the doors to your fat stores. It prioritizes glucose burning exclusively.
So as long as insulin is high, you literally cannot burn fat for energy, no matter how tired you feel or how much stored energy you have on your body.
Correct. The body becomes metabolically rigid. The mitochondria actually lose their efficiency at switching between fuel systems. Your energy stability declines rapidly, and you become entirely dependent on frequent glucose replenishment. But under lower insulin conditions such as during fasting or prolonged physical activity, or when eating a very low carbohydrate diet, the doors unlock. Fat oxidation increases. The organism regains its metabolic adaptability.
It is fascinating and slightly terrifying to realize that so many people are biologically conditioned to burn sugar almost continuously. We have trapped ourselves in a highly volatile metabolic state. But let's talk about what happens when we finally unlock those doors. When insulin drops and the body starts oxidizing fat, what does that actually feel like on a cellular level?
The shift is profound. Fat oxidation is remarkably efficient metabolically. To give you an idea, a single molecule of glucose gives you a certain amount of ATP, but a single molecule of a fatty acid yields vastly more ATP. Fat contains an enormous potential of stored energy. When your mitochondria are efficiently oxidizing fatty acids, your ATP production becomes much more stable. It is less volatile, and it is incredibly long-lasting.
It is the difference between throwing crumpled up newspaper on a fire versus placing a massive, dense oak log on the fire. The paper burns bright and hot, but it is gone in seconds, and you have to keep throwing more paper on just to keep the fire alive. The log takes a little longer to catch, but once it does, it burns steadily for hours, radiating a calm, consistent heat.
Beautifully stated. And that steady burn translates directly to how you feel. When you are running off fat oxidation, you see a massive reduction in energy crashes. Your hunger instability vanishes and your glucose fluctuations smooth out. Your nervous system actually experiences greater energetic consistency. You stop feeling that frantic, jittery need to eat.
That energetic consistency must have a massive impact on the brain. We always hear that the brain needs glucose to survive, which makes people panic at the idea of fasting or cutting carbs. But the brain has its own metabolic flexibility, right? It can adapt to alternative fuels.
It absolutely can, and this is one of the most exciting areas of metabolic science. While it is true that certain parts of the brain require glucose, the brain does not need nearly as much as we consume. During periods of fasting or carbohydrate restriction, when glucose is scarce, the liver steps in and begins producing ketone bodies from mobilized fat.
And ketones are essentially a premium fuel for the brain.
They are an incredibly efficient fuel. These molecules cross the blood-brain barrier with ease. Research suggests that ketones provide major support for mitochondrial efficiency in neurons. They promote neural stability and significantly reduce oxidative stress in the brain. The brain evolved with this metabolic adaptability to ensure that our ancestors could maintain sharp cognition, focus, and problem-solving skills even when they hadn't eaten for days. Think about it if you are starving. That is the exact moment your brain needs to be at its absolute sharpest to figure out how to find food.
That completely flips the modern narrative. We are told to eat a sugary granola bar before a big test or a deep work session to fuel the brain. But actually, mental clarity might profoundly improve when energy delivery becomes metabolically stable through fat and ketones, rather than riding the glucose wave.
Exactly. When you are running on ketones, the mental fog lifts. You are no longer experiencing the neurochemical roller coaster of a sugar high followed by a hypoglycemic dip. The brain loves ketones because they provide a clean, steady, low-emission burn.
This makes me think about the broader societal implications. We are talking about a modern population that is largely trapped inside extreme energy volatility. If everyone is riding this glucose roller coaster, experiencing repeated spikes and crashes, it is not just about physical fatigue. It is about cravings, brain fog, and severe mood instability. We have a society that is chronically irritable, anxious, and reactive, and we treat it as a psychological issue when it might actually be a metabolic one.
That is a very deep and important perspective. We cannot separate the mind from the metabolism. The energetic state of your cells dictates the behavioral state of your mind. When the brain senses a rapid drop in glucose, it perceives that as a survival threat. It triggers the release of adrenaline and cortisol. It creates anxiety. It makes you irritable and short-sighted. By restoring metabolic flexibility, we help stabilize energy availability, which in turn stabilizes mitochondrial function and cognitive endurance. The body, and therefore the mind, becomes fundamentally less dependent on continuous stimulation and feeding.
So, achieving stable, infinite daily energy isn't just a matter of drinking better coffee or getting an extra hour of sleep. Stable energy is actually a fuel management skill that our cells have forgotten, which brings us to the most actionable part of this discussion. How do we get it back? If someone is listening to this completely exhausted, realizing they are trapped in a rigid glucose metabolism, how do they train their cells to become flexible again?
The good news is that metabolic flexibility can absolutely be trained. It behaves almost exactly like physiological conditioning. Just as you can train a muscle to lift heavier weights, you can train your mitochondria to switch fuels more efficiently. There are several key factors that support this adaptability.
I imagine exercise is a massive component of that.
It is foundational. Specifically, a combination of Zone 2 cardiovascular training, which actively builds mitochondrial density and trains the body to oxidize fat at lower intensities, and resistance training. Muscle tissue is a primary sink for glucose. The more muscle you have, and the more active it is, the better you regulate your blood sugar.
What about the nutritional side? We talked about insulin being the gatekeeper, so the goal must be to give insulin a break.
Precisely. This is where intermittent fasting strategies become highly effective. By compressing your feeding window, you are simply giving your body a prolonged period where insulin is low. This forces the cells to start looking for alternative fuel, upregulating the enzymes required for fat oxidation. Alongside that, reducing exposure to ultra-processed foods and prioritizing protein-rich meals helps maintain stable glucose regulation.
It sounds like it is also about aligning with our natural biology. We cannot ignore things like light exposure and sleep.
You cannot out-diet poor sleep. Sleep quality and circadian alignment are deeply intertwined with metabolic health. A poor night of sleep instantly increases insulin resistance the very next day. Your body becomes less efficient at managing glucose. By stabilizing your circadian rhythms, getting sunlight in the morning, avoiding bright screens at night, and sleeping deeply, you create the hormonal environment necessary for metabolic flexibility.
It really is a holistic relearning process. The body gradually relearns this fuel switching efficiency through repeated metabolic practice. It might be uncomfortable for the first few days. If you are used to eating every 2 hours, fasting for 14 hours is going to feel tough because your cells are screaming for glucose and they haven't yet remembered how to access the fat. But once that machinery kicks back online, it is like stepping into a new reality.
It is true metabolic freedom. And this is exactly where the future of medicine and human performance is heading. We are moving away from reactive treatments and increasingly focusing on dynamic metabolic intelligence.
We are already seeing the beginning of this with the explosion of wearable technology. People are walking around with continuous glucose monitors on their arms, rings that track their sleep architecture, and watches that measure heart rate variability.
Yes, emerging technologies are now allowing us to track glucose variability, ketone dynamics, sleep depth, HRV, and recovery on a continuous basis. But the data alone isn't enough. The future lies in AI-driven metabolic optimization, taking all these continuous data streams and interpreting them to provide highly personalized, real-time insights. The medical field is beginning to recognize that energy management is not just a niche biohacking topic, it is foundational to longevity, to cognitive preservation, to elite performance, and to chronic disease prevention.
Because if you fix the energy system, you fix the root cause. Energy stability governs, quite literally, every biological system in the human body. When you think about it, it is a profoundly beautiful concept. We have spent the last few decades trying to outsmart our biology with synthetic stimulants, energy drinks, and highly engineered foods, only to realize that the ultimate upgrade is simply returning to our original design.
Because deep inside every mitochondrion, human biology still remembers those ancient survival rhythms. It remembers the periods of abundance, and it remembers the periods of scarcity. It understands movement, recovery, and flexibility. Our cells know exactly what to do.
Perhaps the human body was never designed for this modern world of endless stimulation and constant, unrelenting feeding. We were built for adaptability. We were built to thrive in dynamic environments.
And perhaps true vitality begins when the body finally rediscovers its forgotten ability to generate energy from within. When you are no longer tethered to your next meal, when your mind is sharp and calm, and when your energy is stable, you have achieved something rare in the modern world. You have achieved metabolic resilience.
It changes the entire paradigm of what it means to be healthy. It is not just about avoiding illness, it is about reclaiming the infinite energy that is already locked inside of us, just waiting for the right signal.
Metabolic flexibility is, ultimately, energy freedom.